Top of the morning, Dan and Amy, and part of yesterday's sell-off was certainly related to the increasing reports about a so-called second wave, or certainly states that have opened up seeing more COVID-19 infections. Now, they're also doing more testing. So, for example, testing increased in Florida 37% in 2 weeks. Confirmed cases have risen 28%.
And most of those cases, the governor said yesterday, were in nursing homes and prisons.
Although, and in some states, like Arizona, cases have increased by 73% in the last 2 weeks. The tests have increased by just 53%, but you still have to look at the subtext. Wall Street Journal reports a quarter of all the cases in the state are in Indian reservations, which especially have high risk populations.
Yeah, the Navajo tribe is hit very hard there.
Native Americans have rates of diabetes twice those of whites. The rate of obesity is 50% higher. So, I mean, again, it's like
And they didn't have immunizations. They have, not different medical procedures than we have.
It's like what we know about the disparity in life expectancy, underlying health conditions between whites and blacks. Nobody likes it. Nobody wishes it was that way, but it is that way. And so it makes certain populations that have a certain prevalence, that have a greater prevalence of certain comorbidities, more vulnerable, which is why you want different people in different circumstances to take different precautions. The one metric, though, that is more important than cases, because this is about the healthcare system, also by extension about the severity of the cases and the expected to the rate of recovery. Hospitalizations in Arizona, the weekly rolling average for COVID hospitalizations has been flat for a month. Hospitals in Arizona and California have reported an increase in cases from U.S. citizens and green card holders returning from Mexico, where hospitals were overwhelmed. But with 22% of ICU beds and 62% of ventilators available, Arizona hospitals should have the capacity to manage an increase in patients as it reopens as needed. Deaths also not surging. Texas has recorded 151 deaths this past week versus 221 in the last week of April. Florida reported 232 deaths, 72 fewer than the last week of April. I mean, I hate to get into just all the recitation of just dry stats, but again, because you have scaremongering going on again, we have to go back to some of the metrics and do a little bit of comparison where we were at the height versus where we are now in the context of additional testing when it comes to cases, and then the healthcare system's capacity to handle more hospitalizations, more severe cases.
And can't we get over the first wave before we keep talking about this alleged second wave that might come, it might not come? I mean, nobody knows for certain. And that's where I stand on that, because I honestly, I don't want to talk about a second wave because we're not done with the first.
And the coverage of this makes it increasingly difficult, particularly against the backdrop of the civil unrest over the last couple of weeks. Tom Elliott over at Grabine put together a nice mashup of how most of the press covered the protests and even the rioting versus how most of the press covered the reopen rallies.
And a far more serious scene. Watch these images. Really just an ugly, a dangerous scene at the state capitol in
Reopen
Michigan.
rallies.
As we look at this extreme group of people,
those pictures and those clashes really show the chaos.
And you're out there with guns?
I don't want to call them rallies. They're not protests.
These quote-unquote protests, I don't even think that that's the right word, because protests are supposed to be peaceful.
I'm not embarrassed to say that I was afraid.
It's not clear what they're demanding to infect other people, demanding to make other people sick.
It's dangerous, and these people can take this home with them and hurt their families and all the rest.
I'd like to ask them if they're willing to sign away their right to treatment if and when they get infected.
Who the hell do you think you are? I don't understand what is wrong with people. Stay at home.
And here comes the pivot.
I want to be clear in how I characterize this. This is mostly a protest. It is not, generally speaking, unruly.
That ain't a riot, what we're seeing right now in Minneapolis.
Any reasonable person would say we shouldn't be destroying other people's property, but these are not reasonable times.
And please, show me where it says that protests are supposed to be polite
and peaceful.
The beautiful thing is we're seeing citizens who are caring and concerned. They're hitting the streets.
Heartwarming to see so many people turn out peacefully.
For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Bret Baier, Fox News anchor, who, of course, hosts a special report, 5 p.m. weekdays on Chicago time. #1 best-selling author of 3 Days at the Brink, FDR's Daring Gamble to Win World War II. Bret, thanks for joining us.
Morning.
Morning. Just setting aside the media coverage for a second, because it's just so obvious, I don't know that it needs comment or additional comment. But the reporting on the so-called second wave, or even just the continuation of the first wave with states that have reopened, and all the contextual factors that have to be considered.
Yeah, I think it's important to put it in context. We go through these waves of coverage, obviously, and COVID and the coverage of COVID took a back seat largely in much of the press once the protests began. And, many, as we saw, of those protests devolved into riots and looting. That coverage is now coming back as that dies down. COVID's coming up. The stats are the stats. I mean, you're right. There is more testing. I think the stat that's worth watching more is the hospitalizations as they go up, not because they're going to get overwhelmed, just because there are more numbers going into the hospital. We've seen all of these places be fine as far as the ability to handle that. And you guys in McCormick Place and didn't really have anybody go down there.
Right.
There's
29
people
total.
there's people in New York and all over the place that had Army Corps of Engineer facilities that didn't see anybody. So it's not the capacity, it's just the fact that those hospitalizations are going up.
Yeah, so social justice matters more than social distancing. But and what broke my heart today, CNN again now has the case count and death toll ticker back up. You guys aren't going to you're not going to do that over at Fox, are you?
I don't think so. I mean, some of that is above my pay grade, but I don't think so. I think we're not going to do it on Special Report, I'll tell you that. We're going to cover it. We're going to cover the story as it is. And, I've often talked about how America and the media coverage is like chapters. Suddenly we're done with this chapter and it's moved on, but we're going to go back to this other chapter. And we're just going to cover the news as it comes.
You had a really compelling interview with Attorney General Barr this week, and we played snippets from it. And I thought one of the more telling exchanges was him addressing this idea that, he's the president's lawyer and he's supposed to be the people's lawyer. And so he shouldn't be, flacking for the president by relitigating what did or didn't happen in 2016 and 2017. Here's what Barr said.
Here's the thing. For the first time in American history, police organizations and the national security organizations were used to spy on a campaign. And there was no basis for it. And the media largely drove that. And all kinds of sensational claims were being made about the president that could have affected the election. And then later on in his administration, there were actions taken that really appear to be efforts to sabotage his campaign. And that has to be looked at. And if people want to say that I'm political because I am looking at those potential abuses of power, so be it. But that's the job of the Attorney General.
And it seems to me the job of the media, and you do it nicely, talking about coverage, is to cover stories that are important, even if they're not the most popular, even if it's not what everybody's focused on. And that's why that interview was relevant, not just because of the Flynn case and more developments on that case this week, but also to remind people about the precedent that was set, why the investigation is occurring, because being a little forward-looking is a good idea, and that Durham report is going to come.
Yeah. And I think it's important that, people beyond Fox News understand what's happening. I mean, there are some places that have to explain from the beginning because they haven't covered it from the beginning.
Yeah.
And that needs to be, it's going to come out. We're going to see what this leads to. I'm not saying that it's definitive going to lead to criminal charges, but boy, it sure sounds like that. It sounded like the Attorney General was saying that the grand jury that had been impaneled was on pause because of COVID, and that it's firing back up again, and that's produced some delay. So we'll see what comes out of it, and we'll cover it as it comes. I do think it's important. I mean, think about, what we saw with impeachment. what we saw with, prior to that, the coverage of Russia and collusion. There hasn't been a single person who's been charged, let alone charged and convicted, as a result of the 2.5 years of Russia investigation. Not even the Russians who were indicted. And, it's worth pointing that out.
Yeah, I mean, and it seems to me, as you say, the importance of the importance of the issues at stake here. The way to deal with the left is really simply just to switch it up and say Trump loses in November and Joe Biden's incoming administration. Would you be happy, copacetic, uninterested if Trump used his personnel the same, if he actively used it? I don't know what Obama did or didn't do, although he was in the meetings. If Trump was in meetings with his senior people and they were engaged in using the powers of the state to investigate the incoming administration, and to the extent there were Trump holdovers for some period of time, they continue that investigation into all things Joe Biden. Would you be fine with that? And of course, no one would say yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's the prism by which we look at things a lot, and what would happen if this was flipped. And I think that, you could even do that with the calls now by Joe Biden that he's worried that Trump is not going to relinquish the White House if he loses, or somehow he's going to push back the election. That is not what has been said. He said November 3rd is when the election is going to happen. And the only people the last time that held on to the thought that the president was illegitimate were the Democrats. So I think you have to look through all sides to be able to cover it fairly.
All right, Bret Baier, President Trump announced that he's going to accept his nomination in Jacksonville, Florida. Are you going to be there?
Of course. Yeah, we'll be at both conventions. I don't know how it's all going to go. We'll probably have masks in between going from place to place, but we'll be there. And it sounds like Florida was with open arms. And I think there's going to be a little bit of backlash in North Carolina about just the economic impact of not having a convention there.
I mean, Jacksonville's nicknamed Actionville. You think Bret Baier's not going to be in a place nicknamed Actionville? Come on, forget about it.
Plus, TPC is right down the road.
Yeah, there you go. Very good. Yes, perfect scheduling. Bret Baier, Fox News anchor, special report, 5 p.m. Chicago time, weekdays, #1 best-selling author of 3 Days at the Brink, FDR's Daring Gamble to Win World War II. Bret, thanks for joining us.
All right, we'll see you.
See you.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's like a hot, steaming cup of information to start your day. It's Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Diabetes, high blood pressure, anxiety meds, everyone's on them. If you're a 50-year-old male, maybe a bit porky, and you may even have type 2 diabetes, $1 million of term insurance